My name's Giles Clark, and in terms of what I do, it's a weird mixture, I suppose. Historically, I've been a zookeeper, and then I've been a manager slash curator slash director at a zoo sanctuary. And I sort of intersperse that with doing contribution stuff towards television programs and series. So I'm by no means a television presenter. In fact, that makes me feel uncomfortable even thinking about myself in those terms. But at the same time, it's so, a big part of what we should be doing in terms of working in zoos is communicating those really important messages, reach a much wider audience. So I don't know, I suppose at the end of the day, I like to think of myself as just being a compassionate and caring human being above all else.
So animals then, have you always been an animal lover?
Like I would owe so much of, so like everybody, I owe so much to my mum and dad's sort of love of the natural world and compassion towards animals. So, my affinity with cats, if you like, my mum always puts down to the fact that, she had cats before I was even born. So apparently, whilst I was cooking away in her belly, the cats would sleep on her belly and purr. And so that's my mum's side of events as to why I love cats so much. But it gives you an indication, I was surrounded by cats from the moment I was born. And then, growing up, we grew up in a very high density area of North London, high-rise flats and very, urban. But at every opportunity, every weekend, we'd be out walking in the countryside and the parks, and I think that was, that's what really initially sort of kickstarted my connection. But like every, like when you think about it, there isn't I can't think of a single child that I've ever met at a really young and impressionable age that isn't absolutely fascinated by animals and the natural world. As we grow up, it's almost taught out of us by society and by adults. And that was always encouraged with me, not told to leave it alone.
Yeah, it is. You're so right. It's the fascination, isn't it? It's something else that kind of like looks different and smells different, and so yeah, I've got a little niece and a nephew, and they love it. They love every animal. Like, we've got local zoos and things to us, and we go and see these, and they're fascinated, absolutely fascinated.
I agree. And zoos is, that's part of we're jumping around here with conversation a bit, but that's why part of the reason zoos are so important and vital, because I remember my very, very first visit to the zoo, and I kind of, I certainly wasn't in of school age, so I was barely more than a toddler, and I distinctly remember, the fascination of looking across and seeing big cats, and that they play such an important, vital role, not only in terms of being sort of this insurance policy for different species genetically, but in terms of education, in terms of raising both direct and indirect support for conservation. But actually, for a big chunk of society, that's the only opportunity they're going to have that sort of real connection and engagement to some of these animals. It's one thing, quite often you hear, oh, we must save the tiger so our children and their grandchildren have the opportunity to see them in the wild. But really, how many of our children or grandchildren are going to see them, even if they're still there? Fingers crossed, touch wood. But beyond that, and I don't believe in keeping animals in zoos just for the sake of, so we've got them and people can see them. There's much more to it than that, but it's definitely an important element.
Yeah, definitely. So when you were growing up, you loved animals. Did you want to work with them, or did you have another kind of like role?
I was definitely a typical boy. Like I remember at some point, I think for a few months after watching Top Gun, I was definitely going to become a fighter pilot. And then at some point. At some point, I think I dabbled with the idea of being a fireman sounds cool, but then found out that, I used to wear glasses and that was definitely off the table as well. But no, ultimately I remember, and remember always thinking I wanted to work with animals. I sort of grew up with the notion that I was going to become a vet and save them all. And although I really enjoyed school, you know, when I was doing my GCSEs and found out that to become a vet, I would have to not only do my A levels, which I eventually went on to do, but then another 5 years. I quickly put that to one side. But it was, you know, it was whilst I was still at school that my journey, if you like, with animals really began. Because when I think I was 14 and got the opportunity to do work experience, and you get the list from the careers officer, and I was not interested in, you know, working in a reception at a dentist, or, you know, making cups of tea in a mechanics or what have you. So I went to the teacher that was in charge and said, look, can I find my own placement? And she said, well, sure, as long as they have the right insurance. So I inquired. At the time, I sort of lived fairly close, not too far away from London Zoo, but all their placements were, obviously other people have had the same idea, and their placements were already full, and I couldn't go there. So, you know, my mum reminded me of what at the time was a small wildlife park outside London in Hertfordshire, and she says, you know, called Paradise. It's called Paradise Wildlife Park now, and it was then, but only just. Before that, it was Broxbourne Zoo, and my mum reminded me, and so then that's, you know, at 14 years of age, I did 2 weeks work experience there, and ultimately I've never really left, because that's where I worked. You know, every weekend I would volunteer, every school holiday. It's where I got my first job. And I'm still very connected to Paradise Park now through the Big Cat Sanctuary. Yeah. So they're sister parks. And, you know, for me, seeing there's a personal journey attached to it, but also just seeing how Paradise Wildlife Park has transformed over the years as a facility is absolutely incredible. So, you know, when I joined, it was only, trying to think, you know, less. It was about 5 or 6 years. The Sampson family had taken it over, and before that, it was Broxbourne Zoo. And at the time, Broxbourne Zoo in the national media, it was known as the worst zoo in Britain. You know, so to see where they've taken it from over the years is absolutely incredible, and then to extend that further, you know, to acquire the Big Cat Sanctuary and to then develop that as a facility and as a organisation to the work that it supports, you know. So I'd like to think, you know, I'm very grateful for the people that I've met along the way in terms of my journey, and I'd like to think that it's not just luck, you know, that I have put a lot of hard work in and volunteering over the years, and a lot of sacrifice, but definitely a big chunk of it has been supported by, you know, some amazing people along the way.
Yeah, amazing. So you said there about it being like a journey, your whole, you know, starting off in this zoo and going kind of like from strength to strength. Tell us about your standout moments in your career. Have you got any, or is it too difficult to like pinpoint one thing?
Oh my goodness, it is really difficult. There's so many, you know. Then, and I thought about this the other day, and someone asked me a very similar on the spot on a live radio interview, and there's so many different experiences and opportunities I've had. You know, I've been so incredibly privileged and lucky. But in terms of, you know, captivity and working with animals, you know, in captivity from a zoo or sanctuary perspective, you know, I've had some unbelievable moments of privilege, not least of all being present when, you know, cubs are born, having such a strong bond and relationship with the cub's mother, you know, with the female that's giving birth, that not only does she, you know, tolerate me, but she's actually looking towards me for reassurance sometimes. You know, that's an amazing experience. But then in terms of you know, beyond that, when I think about wildlife, you know, for me, it's about keeping it in the wild. It's about, you know, doing everything we can to protect it and its habitat and where it should be. There's always one example that I use, and it's so my career took me around the world, and I've lived in various countries, both working in the field and working at, what we call ex situ. So zoos and good sanctuaries are ex situ conservation facilities. And so I worked for what was Steve Irwin Zoo, Australia Zoo in Queensland in Australia for a long time. And whilst I was there, one of my responsibilities was to help oversee the support that Australia Zoo gave to in situ conservation projects. So programs and projects that are working on conservation where those species or that landscape is endemic to, right? So,
yeah.
And one of the ones that we were working with was the Cambodian elephant conservation program in Cambodia. And we went out, so left Phnom Penh, drove for about 4 or 5 hours, got on what was literally a dugout log as a boat, and we went down river for, I don't know, at least 2.5, maybe 3 hours into the forest, and we went into this range of villages that was not deep within the forest or on the forest edge, and quite often that's where a lot of, for obvious reasons, human wildlife conflict or interaction happens, because it's the interface of where people and wildlife are mixing. And this range of 6 or 7 villages was coming under a lot of pressure from elephants. So elephants, are incredibly destructive if you happen to own a rice paddy field or any other agricultural crop that they like, to get their trunks around. And ultimately, that's people's livelihoods. That's the way in which they survive, they feed their families, or they sell a surplus, etc., etc. And so elephants were coming out every harvest season, raiding the crops, and people were retaliating. People, had no other choice. They had to do something, and ultimately elephants were being killed. And we went to this one region, and FFI had been, Fauna and Flora International was the conservation organisation that had set up the Cambodian Elephant Project. And one of their strategies is to always engage at a local level, the people and the communities, because ultimately that's the only way you'll have sustainable conservation.
Yeah.
And we went to a village where the previous year 17 elephants had been killed because of human elephant conflict. And we went into what was no more than, quite a well constructed but wooden shed at the end of the day. It was made out of wood and tin roof, probably the size, maybe 3 times the size of an average person's living room. And that was the regional school. So before the project went in, those children in those villages didn't have access to education, because you can see the process that I took just to get to, their region. And a little boy stood up and read me a story about why it was important to save the elephants in his forest, in his country. Now, that little boy was 12 years of age, and the teacher was translating and then told me that 6 months previous, so 6 months ago, there wasn't the school, and 6 months ago that 12-year-old boy couldn't read or write. And the only reason he can now read and write is because of an elephant conservation project.
Yeah.
And it was really humbling to see. That's what effective conservation looks like. It's not only helping wildlife, and it's not only protecting ecosystems and landscapes, but by doing so, it's working with and providing for local people and communities, and I thought that's probably one of the, and there's lots of examples like that, but that's got to be one of the most sort of poignant examples in terms of, for me, how people say, well, actually, conservation, it's a sort of nice to have, isn't it? It's a luxury, but there's lots of other problems in the world, and actually, no, it's a conservation and protecting our natural world is a must-have, and it's not only important for all the reasons that we know and understand, but actually, conservation is about looking after people, and not just immediately, it's our future generations as well. So it's quite a long answer to your question.
No, it's amazing because what you're saying is you're, in doing the conservation, you're not, like you say, not only saving, so much of our natural world, you're opening up a world to somebody else. Like you say, that little boy didn't have this world of education and arts and all this other thing, and you're opening that up to someone else, and
just to add to that, the following year we created a whole strategy around trying to mitigate the conflict with those elephants, and we significantly reduced it. So there was far few times where elephants were coming in and raiding the agricultural fields, but even the few times that they did, people were much more tolerant and much more accepting, because we had given them other means and methods to provide for themselves, in terms of growing crops that elephants are not particularly fond of, like chilies, for example, or other means and mechanisms, and there was a much greater tolerance. And within 2 years, that same region that were responsible for killing numerous elephants every harvest season, we didn't lose a single elephant, even though there was still the occasional conflict situation. So really, the overarching sort of message for me, whether we're talking about elephants coming in to raid people's rice fields, or tigers taking people's goats, or even the way in which, we in the more developed world interact with the natural world, is that it's about creating balance. We've got to live much more harmoniously with our environment, because something that you're often hearing at the moment is about how much is the services that the natural world, how much value do we put on that in terms of the economy, and so the most recent figure is the natural world provides $125 trillion worth of support to our economy. But I think to myself, how do we put a price on our life support system? Because if we keep smashing it around with a hammer, it's going to stop working. And then what value is it? And people say, oh, well, how can we affect change, because it will have such a drastic effect on the economy? Well, our grandchildren won't be having to worry about the economy if we continue to do what we're doing, because they're going to have such a massive detrimental effect on our own kind, let alone the natural world.
Absolutely. So you said about traveling all around the world. Have you had a favorite place that you visited?
Oh my goodness. I always get, and I love going to anywhere where I'm going to see wildlife or experience a new environment, etc. Like I just can't describe or put into words how that makes me feel. But there is a particular sort of buzz that I get if I'm ever in an environment, whether that's a rainforest in Southeast Asia, or a dry desert in somewhere else in Asia, or the savannah in East Africa. If I know that there is wild cats there, I get a particular feeling, like I can't describe, not scared feeling, obviously, there's just something that makes me feel alive, but also really humble. And all of a sudden you're back in the pecking order and on the food chain where you sort of should be, but anywhere that there's wildlife. I've been really lucky to visit Bhutan. That was absolutely fascinating and beautiful country, and in fact probably one of the only countries currently at the moment that is wholeheartedly putting its environment as the number one priority. Like it's over 60% covered still in forest.
Wow.
And their mandate is to try and not only maintain that and increase it. Whereas you look at any other government's policy around the world,
Yeah.
and it's at the moment, when we talk about the imbalance, it's about the way in which we view governments, businesses, societies, for the best part, review the natural world as sort of being a resource to be used, exploited, and taken advantage of. Whereas really the people, it was a fascinating place to be. So Bhutan, but I've lived in India as well. And that was my real sort of first adventure, if you like. And India is always going to hold a very special place, for me. There's something really, really magical. First time I saw a tiger in the wild, first real conservation project that I worked on, and so there's something magical about India.
Definitely. So you talk about conservation efforts and things like that. What are you working on at the moment? Who do you partner with? I'm guessing it's who do you not?
No, I feel so lucky and privileged. I still work obviously with the Big Cat Sanctuary and for the Big Cat Sanctuary as a director, but beyond that, I'm either a trustee, a patron, an ambassador, a vice president, or in some cases several of those for, I don't know, must be about 7 or 8 different organizations around the world now. So, some are very well known and renowned, like Fauna and Flora International. Others are a bit smaller and quite species focused. The Cheetah Conservation Fund, Free the Bears, Helping Rhinos, Old Conservationist. So I'm very, very, very I feel very lucky and very privileged, and I try and do as much as I can to, forward their cause. I wholeheartedly and truly always believe in projects that I work with in terms of the work that they're doing, obviously. And so, whether that's giving interviews or hosting online events or what have you, the case may be. But so I'm never short of things to be getting on with or projects to work with. So.
No, but that's the thing. If it must be humbling for you when people reach out and ask you to be part of their work.
Oh, completely. Absolutely, completely. And I feel bad. I've in terms of in the last 12 months, I've had to turn some down. Not because I don't believe in what they're doing. It's just that I just don't feel I would have the time to be able to commit myself wholeheartedly to supporting what they do. And so then I worry that, by doing so, am I going to sort of dilute not only their work, but also how effective I can be for the other projects and programs. I really, truly, truly feel like sometimes I feel exhausted, but I never feel exasperated. Like I truly believe that it's a privilege to, and it's also, I feel that as a responsibility as well. A responsibility in terms of the animals, the species of wildlife. That's the other thing we should never ever forget either, is that when we in terms of conservation, sometimes it's quite easy to get caught up and lost in stats and figures and numbers, especially the media. They always want to know, like, how many are left. Tell us, like, how many were there 100 years ago? How many were there left? And you can quite easily, because that's sort of a marker. If you say to someone, oh, well, 100 years ago, there was, 150,000 cheetahs and now we've got 7,000, people go, oh, okay, I can see. But at the same time, you think, well, 7,000, that sounds still quite a lot. But if you break down the information in terms of range and habitat, and it's not. But beyond that, we can quite easily lose sight that we're talking about individuals. Those animals are individuals. And more, science is rocketing now, but more and more we're learning that those individual animals, feel and experience the whole range of different things that we feel as people. And so, doesn't for I use this example when I do tours around the big cat sanctuary occasionally, and we go and look at the Amur leopards, and we say, there's 80 of these left in the wild, if we're lucky, which is slightly more than what there was a decade ago. But and it's so hard to gauge, whether there's 80 or 100 or 160. There's not thousands, right? Yeah. But at the end of the day, when I'm looking at one of those leopards, that leopard doesn't know or care about how many of its species are left in the wild. What it cares about is its immediate surroundings, its its needs being met, etc., etc., etc. And it's the same as when I've seen animals in wildlife markets, and they're the most despicable, abhorrent, disgusting aspects of what humanity does to wildlife. But when you walk around there and you think, my goodness, and I've seen some incredibly endangered species in wildlife markets, mainly more so probably reptiles and birds than some endangered animals as well. But you think at the end of the day, the suffering that individual is going through. Yes, I'm thinking about, my God, we know that there's only X number of those left in the wild, but at the end of the day, that individual is important to that individual, so it's a combination of trying to sort of mix, like we said back at the beginning, it's that sort of it's about, for me, it's about being compassionate, and it's about being kind, as well as the bigger picture, as well as the science.
Yeah, definitely. So we've watched you hand rear baby animals. What do your family think about that?
I don't. Well, it's sort of normal now, like so, or it has been, to be honest. That since last year and being involved in with the bears, I've just had my dogs. But beyond that, I've been working in zoos, since I was a teenager, and I've had, for the best part of that career, vocation, I've had quite a unique aspect in terms of the interaction and the hands-on stuff that I've been exposed to or doing with the animals. And so over the years, I've hand reared, dozens and dozens of different individuals of, multiple species. Yeah. People around me sort of just get used to it, and it becomes the norm. But it is, when you think about it, it is, it is unusual, I suppose.
It's extraordinary. It is absolutely extraordinary. It really, really is. And do you, how does that make you feel, knowing that you're part of that?
I think when you're doing it at the time, again, I take that responsibility incredibly seriously, and so I'm very much focused on what I'm physically doing, which is ultimately, incredibly challenging when you're hand rearing animals. It's like bringing up babies. It's a constant cycle of getting feeds ready, sterilizing bottles, cleaning, and then it goes around again and again every 2 or 4 hours, depends on which, what stage and what you're hand rearing. But beyond that, again, it's the responsibility, of trying to make sure that we are putting back or doing absolutely everything we possibly can. So in terms of the television work that I've done, the first time people would have been exposed to what I do was with a pair of tiger cubs called Spot and Stripe. When I was in Australia, we did a program called Tigers About the House, and they were physically two of the most important cubs in the entire captive breeding program, because genetically they were completely unrepresented. So there was a lot of emphasis on that aspect. But beyond that, those two little cubs helped us at Australia Zoo generate hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of support that we put back into the tiger protection and conservation units in Sumatra. And so that's, that was my driving force. And that was, I was considering that every single day. And it wasn't about, how can I put this, and I've in the past received, a lot of questions and sometimes criticism to say, oh, what you're doing is not natural and it's not right and it's unconventional. And so therefore, am I exploiting an animal to commercially make money off of it? And I think, well, I would always do things, that first and foremost, it was always in that individual animal's best interest. But beyond that, when people say, oh, it's not natural, any animal, it doesn't matter how nice your enclosure looks, if you've got an animal in an enclosure in a zoo, it's not natural. No. Because you're immediately, taking away its ability to be able to make some of the choices that it naturally would in the wild. Yeah. And you're controlling its breeding, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got to think beyond, oh, okay, that's not natural. Now, if I wasn't doing if what I was doing with that particular animal is not detrimental, and in some cases even positive to their welfare and their care, and yet I can create awareness and support to help wild tigers, why wouldn't I?
Exactly.
Why wouldn't? Absolutely. So why wouldn't I? So yeah. So wow. I suppose, and we could talk. I could talk about that part as I could about conservation, all day. But it's ultimately, I truly can put my hand on my heart and say that when I've worked hands-on with animals, it's because it's, I think, in their best interest and also creating support. And I can, one last example, and we can move on to the next question or subject. But we had, when I was working at Australia Zoo, there's two facilities in Australia that work in that sort of unique, interactive, hands-on approach. And there was a university down in Sydney that did a study of normal zoos, good zoos, but their tiger enclosures, not of the tigers, but of the way in which the public, so the guests, view that enclosure in comparison to the way in which people would engage and view the interactive tiger displays. So normal zoo and the way that we were doing things at the time. The average length of time the person would spend in front of a normal tiger enclosure is less than 60 seconds, because tigers are cats at the end of the day. They're usually asleep at the far end of the enclosure, in amongst the bamboo. Occasionally you'll see a leg or a tail come up or what have you. But they're not very active, or they're anticipating something in terms of foods coming, etc., etc. So anyway, regardless of the mechanisms, they're less than 60 seconds. The average length of time that people would watch our enclosure, because there was handlers or keepers or carers interacting with the cats, and most of the time, to be fair, the cats were still asleep. We just happened to be sat next to them and I could talk to people on a microphone. But that average length of time was over 15 minutes. Wow. So in terms of conveying a message, whether you're talking about that individual cat or you're talking about conservation, which one do you think is more effective in terms of translating that into support? 60 seconds or 15 minutes? I feel it's something I feel very strongly about. Now, you have to make sure to be able to do that, you've got the right facilities and the right resources. And that's, so I'm not suggesting that every zoo sanctuary should rush out and start, having a hands-on interactive policy. That's not the case at all. But I'm using it as a sort of demonstration that, I think we used it for a force for good.
Yeah, definitely. It's very true. When you go to a lot of different like zoos, establishments where they've got somebody there talking about the animal, talking about conservation and their natural habitat and things, you're more likely to stand and listen, aren't you? You know,
100%.
than read it off a board.
Yeah. Yeah, no, 100%. And you're even more likely to hang around if the animal's doing something, interacting with an object or some enrichment or feeding, whilst someone's talking about it, as
Definitely.
well. So yeah, no, it's about translating it into. I always use the word capture. You want to capture the audience. You want to, you want to capture the guests' hearts, imaginations. So they would go away and
Of course.
be slightly better armed, if you like, to want to help, want to make a difference.
Yeah, but the thing is, if you engage them, then you're more likely for them to go home, and particularly nowadays, where you can literally just go on your phone, your iPad, whatever. You don't even have to go out and get a book, to then help or research or better understand what it was that you were talking about. Than if you weren't captivating, if you weren't engaging with people, people are going to be like, oh yeah, cool, that there were some nice tigers. Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean? There's no that
100%.
that was the end of that conversation, rather than actually, oh, you left me wanting more, you left me wanting to understand a little bit about this, that, and the next thing.
Yeah.
So this must be a really tough question for you, but do you have a favorite? Secretly, do you have a favorite animal that you just love?
Oh, yeah, that's really tough, isn't it? They are all incredible, fascinating. That, I think, again, it comes back to that thing for me, like all individuals of a species and are completely different as well, in terms of personality and characters. And everyone knows that, if you've got two cats or two dogs, or you can see that they've got their own differences and personalities. But in terms of a favorite species, it's so difficult, isn't it? I'm a bit cliche. It would definitely have to be one of the mammals. Like
Yeah.
I have all the respect in the world for birds and reptiles and insects and fish, but I can't help it. I'm a
Yeah.
bit of a sucker, like everyone else is, for cute eyes and cute faces and
Yeah.
charismatic, beautiful looking. But at the end of the day, what can I say? If we go back to the cats, they're all incredible, but
Yeah.
the tiger's king, right? It is
Yeah.
absolutely magnificent. It's beautiful. Like, I'm always in awe, no matter how many times, and I've seen probably a fair few more tigers than most people, but no, I'm still I still get this, like, feeling inside of being
Yeah.
when I'm around them, in their presence, of
Yeah.
being in total awe. But so tigers are definitely up there. But I say that, and then last year, spending 12 months with Mary. Oh,
Oh.
Mary the sun bear. She
Oh.
you know she was life changing as well, and
Yeah.
absolutely stunning and beautiful and fascinating.
Yeah.
And then, clouded leopards. I've been lucky enough to work around clouded leopards and have, several unbelievable experiences with it. So it's so hard to pick, but
Yeah.
I'm going to be loyal. I'm going to stick with tigers.
Amazing. So, is there a particular project or somewhere you'd love to go, or an animal you're desperate to work with?
Oh goodness. Um, um, hmm. There's lots, I suppose. There is the short answer. There's loads of places that I want to visit, mainly because there's fascinating wildlife. Like, I'm desperate to go and see uh, jaguars in the wild at some point.
Wow.
That
Yeah.
that would be absolutely incredible. And again, having that connection with having hand reared one. But
Yeah.
but and I could rattle off uh, a dozen species or places. I think, and then I would feel intensely guilty that I was not moving on, but I've got all of these other projects and programs that are so desperate for help. But my heart, I've always felt, has been in Asia. I went to India, lived there for 2 years, and spent a lot of time working and visiting projects in Southeast Asia. And then, God, it's starting to feel like a long time ago now, but 14 years ago was the first time I went to Africa. And, and I always thought, oh, this is going to be amazing. What an experience. But, nothing will ever replace India or Asia for me. And yet it does get in your blood. It gets under your skin, East Africa, especially for me. And there's part of me feels that there's an inkling that I want to do more there in the future. Like I work with and support an amazing conservancy in Kenya. And it truly would be one of my favorite places in the world in terms of it's called Old Pejeta Conservancy, and it's because of its philosophy, and it's because of the way it's embedded itself within that region. That for me is absolutely incredible. Yeah, it's a beautiful place. You'll wake up in the morning, unzip your tent, and you can see the silhouette of Mount Kenya on the horizon. And then it's got the largest population of black rhinos in East Africa, highest density of lions outside the Masai Mara. So it's an incredible place. Landscape wise, maybe not the most beautiful place I've ever been to, but it's because it's really taken that model of being holistic in its strategies and the way in which it works with, engages, employs the local communities to tackle the conservation challenges. It's enabled it to become really a role model, and that's the word I would use. It's a role model. And then I think to myself, every time I go, imagine if you could roll this out across not only East Africa but other places in terms of what it does and the way that it does it. More importantly, conservation and the world would be in a much better place. So I don't know. We'll see where life takes us.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. So my very last question for you is, what is next for you? What do you have in the pipeline? I mean, it's very difficult at the moment because
yeah, it's almost impossible to.
Yeah.
I'm fearing that we're all going to be, shut up for the winter again soon, with the current state of the world with the pandemic. But what's next? This week I'm working on a project with Fauna and Flora International. It's a campaign actually. It's called Our One Home campaign, and that's. Last month there was the United Nations Biodiversity Summit, and Fauna and Flora International was one of nearly 150 conservation organisations that presented a letter to the Secretary General about it's an absolute must. We must get governments and state members and corporations and businesses that are part of the state members to invest in protecting the natural world. Because we hear about climate crisis, and climate change all the time, but we're facing another crisis in terms of biodiversity loss and the species of wildlife and trees and ecosystems and plants, etc., that are on the brink of extinction. And we're heading towards, in some areas, what could potentially be ecological collapse. And then that has a tipping point. We can only sustain so many of those before it's completely irreversible. So I'm really passionate about that. And so people, can jump online and sign the petition for our One Home campaign. I've got a project coming up for Old Pejeta and Helping Rhinos. We're trying to do a big online event in November, where people can join us. So traditionally, if you go to Africa, the sundowners having a drink as the sun goes down with a beautiful wildlife and horizon. So we're going to try and replicate that virtually online and do a big information / fundraising event that I'll be helping to host. And I've got lots of other little projects that I'm working on, but it's all remotely at the moment for obvious reasons. But actually, something that we didn't touch on, if I've got another couple of minutes or another minute, I can summarize this really quickly in terms of people talk about, and rightly so, look at the turmoil that the world has been thrust into in the last 6 months with the pandemic. Now, experts seriously, believe, and it's almost certain, that COVID-19, so the coronavirus, came from the way in which we treat the natural world. So because, like so many other what we call zoonotic diseases, so diseases that originate in animals, wildlife, and then are go through the process and then are passed on to people, like SARS, if you remember SARS back in the 20 years ago now, like Ebola 10 years ago, like HIV 40 years ago with primates in Africa. It's the way in which, so whether it's because we are continuing to erode habitat and we're pushing that interface of people and wildlife and livestock agriculture ever closer together, or more than likely what probably happened is that the species that are kept in wildlife markets are in such close contact with each other, they're so stressed physically and psychologically that they start shedding viruses that get passed on and then ultimately make that jump to humans. But if we don't take any, if there's a silver lining from this whole horrid situation of COVID-19, then it surely must be we need to be looking at the way in which we interact with the natural world and we engage with it, and we need to start treating it with respect. Because can you imagine if the next zoonotic disease in another 20 or 30 years time is as contagious as coronavirus but as deadly as Ebola, like it would be absolutely devastating. And I very much doubt whether we'll see huge hordes of people having a party in the streets of Liverpool the night before they're being told that they've got to stop. So it's and I can understand people's frustrations, but I think the thing that I would want people to take away is, at the moment, our generation, we have the luxury and the abilities to be able to make choices. And whilst it might, some of them be slightly inconvenient, and borderline, okay, it might make things a little bit uncomfortable, they're still choices. And we are taking that away from the next generation and the generation beyond that. Because, in terms of the evolution of the natural world, the earth and species, like it's not even the blink of an eye in terms of what humans have done in the last couple of 100 years. But if we continue that level of devastation for the next 200, it will be the world will be a very, very different and a much sadder place. So really people just need to look and evaluate what they do, the resources that they use. People ask me every day, what can I do? Well, and I'm far from being anywhere near perfect, and I'm not a vegetarian or a vegan, but I've almost eliminated, I have eliminated all red meat from my diet, and I try and eat, as sustainably as I possibly can with other animal protein, and that's partly because I obviously do have a consideration for the way in which animals are treated, But beyond that, one of the most devastating practices that we do, humans do, is the way in which we treat the land for grazing cattle, effectively. If you think about what's happening right now in the Amazon, we call the Amazon the lungs of the world, and we could, debate for another time as to where our oxygen comes from, but there's no disputing just how vital the Amazon is as an ecosystem to the world, to the globe. If you think currently we're chopping down and then burning the forest to make way for grazing agricultural land for beef that will be then eaten all around the world, or it's being cut down to grow crops that are then fed to not humans but beef in turn. And I just think, my God, we've got to really and quickly evaluate what we're doing.
Make a choice, make a change.
Exactly. That's a good phrase.
I just thought about it when you were talking then. When you were talking then, it just resonates so much with me that, over the past kind of 7 months, we've all had to make choices, we all had to make changes, we've all had to make sacrifices in some which way or another. And I kind of think, if we do it one step at a time, the change that we can make can be catastrophic, rather than the losses that we make will be catastrophic.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Spot on. Well done. You should go into communication.
Well, do you know what? I think when it's something that you're really passionate about, I've followed your work for years and years and years and years, as have my family, and along with so many other people, it's something that I'm really passionate about. It's something that I support lots of different charities, and and I think people think because you're in the world of musical theatre that's the only thing that you're passionate about, but it's not like so many other people, and I kind of feel like I've always wanted to have the chance to talk to someone like you, because it fascinates me so much.
Thank you.
And I've always looked at all these different projects and thought, how could I get into something like that, as well as doing what I do with my job, and I've had the best time talking to you. Thank you so much for giving up your time, because I know you're so busy.
Oh, well, it's been a real pleasure, and I've really enjoyed it. And the more we can talk about it, the more we can communicate it.
Definitely.
Every little step is really important. And if one person that watches this thinks about consciously making a change, or we've done our bit, or we're trying to do our bit.
Absolutely. And that's the thing with the children that I work with. We often raise money for charity. It's something that I feel very passionate about, and I've got lots of charities that I support, and lots of them are within the field of theatre and music and stuff like that. But we, when Australia had all those awful fires, it was at the start of the year, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was January time.
Yeah, January.
It was like, right, this is what we're going to do, and I found lots of different charities we pulled together, and we raised lots of money, because I feel it's just as important to teach them about that as it is to teach them about theatre and that kind of side of things too.
Well done you, honestly, well done. Hats off, because it is so important. We're not
massively.
That, and again, we're just connected to every other living thing out there, and it's so important. And what at the end of the day, we talk about it's the future generations, but what right do we have? So definitely. In terms of everything, every other living thing out there has got as much right as we have, and we should 100%. treat it with respect. So
absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time. I've had a brilliant time chatting with you. Take care. Best wishes for everything. And I'd love
thank you
to
so
keep
much.
in touch.
Thanks for support.
No worries Brilliant. At all. Yeah, we'll have to keep in touch with lots of different things. Let me know what you're doing, and anything that we can do to support it and stuff would be brilliant.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Amazing. No worries. Take care. Speak to you soon.
Same to you. Speak soon. Bye.
Bye.
Wow. What a privilege to chat with Giles, and I really hope you all enjoy that fantastic interview. And also check out some of the things that he's talking about. I'll make sure I put a link up of Giles's Instagram page, and you can follow all of the great success stories that he has, the conservation work that he does, and also some of the charities and programs that he helps and works with. Thank you so much once again, Giles. I had such a blast. Thank you. Stay tuned. Make sure you join me next time for another brilliant guest. Take care, everyone. Stay safe. Bye.